Managing change on the Korean Peninsula is the most urgent challenge in Northeast Asia, not Korea's nuclear program, North Korea's nuclear program. I've made the first point many times before throughout the 1990s, and I'm adding this point, not North Korea's nuclear program, because that has become the first priority with this administration's approach to the Korean Peninsula, which I think is a mistake, and you will understand why as I elaborate further. I don't think we can understand what it makes sense to do or where we are today unless we look back in a long historical perspective. I realize a long historical perspective in East Asia can be 2 or 3 millennia, but I will just look back 1 century, which is probably current history in the view of many Asians. The visit of Gorbachev to Beijing in May of 1989 was a dramatic turning point. He essentially conceded all 3 points to China. Great reduction in the troops. The troop buildup had been from about 15 or 17 divisions in the early 1960s to over 60 divisions on the Chinese border out in Northeast Asia over the next decade. So this had been a huge buildup, and to start pulling those back was a major factor. The decision to get out of Afghanistan also was favorable. I mean, it was really made sense for the Soviet Union, objectively, maybe not emotionally or subjectively in the eyes of some Soviet leaders, but it was another concession to China as seen in that relationship. And to stop playing the game it was playing in Southeast Asia was yet another concession. And it was an extraordinary affair, somewhat unhappy from the Chinese viewpoint because Tiananmen Square occurs while he's there. But nonetheless, it was a major change. Then the next, and I think even perhaps as much or more significant in the sense of creating urgency, was the fall of 1990 when Gorbachev recognizes South Korea. Why does this make Korea the most urgent problem we're facing? Because suddenly North Korea is essentially isolated. It had swung heavily to dependency on the Soviet Union. Its relationships with China were not good at all, highly dependent on Soviet oil, energy, on weapons supply. It could face, or was facing, a terrible crisis. And the idea of change on the Korean Peninsula became real. This was no longer some prospect for a distant future. This could happen any time. Could this regime collapse? Yes, maybe. What was the reaction in South Korea at the time? Initially, I think euphoria. There was a lot of excitement about prospects for reunification. Then that began to change. And as I followed it, it seemed that this was the major reason for the change. The business community began to watch what was happening in Germany. It saw the reunification of Germany as costing West Germany enormous sums, which it did. Therefore, by the fall of 1990 and into 1991, South Korean enthusiasm for an early collapse and a reunification began to wane. And more, we began to hear Korean spokesmen talk about a soft landing in North Korea, not a hard landing. There wasn't anybody really against a hard landing that I could see in after the normalization with the Soviet Union in October of 1989. But that began to change. I've always been puzzled at that change on the part of the business community because there was a huge difference between Germany's position and South Korea's position, West Germany's position. West Germany had a very costly social welfare network, net under its society, which was very expensive to fund, these welfare transfer payments. Korea didn't have those. So had there been a rapid reunification, South Korea would not have been obliged to pick up these big welfare payments in the north, which seemed to frighten the community. In fact, a Korean economist once made a presentation at a conference that Hudson Institute hosted in Japan, explaining that businessmen in Korea should not see North Korea as an economic burden, but as an investment opportunity. Because here would be labor that was probably cheaper, new prospects for expanding economy and so forth. It would be a difficult time, but if looked at from purely an investment and growth point of view, an opportunity, not a burden. But that view does not seem to have prevailed.